May 24, 1944, 4:47 a.m., North Atlantic 320 miles west of the Azores. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Sullivan stood on the pitching deck of the USS Guadalcanal, watching a German U-boat surface 400 yards off the starboard bow. His carrier, if you could call it that, was smaller than most destroyers. The flight deck was so short that pilots joked you could spit from bow to stern. Wind gusts were hitting 35 knots. The ship rolled 18 degrees with each swell. Sullivan had 9 aircraft. The U-boat had a deck gun and 20 torpedoes. In 30 seconds, one of them would be on the ocean floor. Before we continue with Commander Sullivan's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to the North Atlantic, May 1944, where Commander Sullivan was about to prove that size doesn't matter when you're hunting wolves in the deep. Daniel Sullivan was 26 years old when he volunteered for carrier duty in 1942. He'd grown up in Duluth, Minnesota, working on the ore freighters that hauled iron down from the Mesabi Range. He was 5'8", wiry, with hands that knew rope and steel. The Navy rejected him twice. Poor eyesight. He memorized the eye chart. Third time, they let him in. They didn't tell him he'd be commanding a ship built on a merchant hull. The escort carriers, jeep carriers, sailors called them, or baby flattops, were never supposed to fight. They were stopgaps, conversions. The Navy took cargo ship hulls, welded on a 500-foot flight deck, crammed in a hangar, and called it an aircraft carrier. They were 512 feet long. A real carrier like the USS Enterprise was 827 feet. They displaced 7,800 tons. The Enterprise displaced 25,500 tons. They had a top speed of 19 knots, barely faster than a surfaced U-boat. Their armor plating was so thin you could punch through it with a sledgehammer. Pilots called them Kaiser coffins because Henry Kaiser's shipyards pumped them out in 90 days. One sailor described them as a tanker with a plank nailed on top. But in 1942, they were all the Atlantic had. Between September 1939 and March 1943, German U-boats sank 452 Allied merchant ships. That's 5 million tons of cargo, food, fuel, ammunition, tanks, resting on the ocean floor. The losses peaked in November 1942. 117 ships sunk in 1 month. Churchill later wrote that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. The problem was simple. The Atlantic was too big. Fleet carriers couldn't waste time escorting convoys. They were needed in the Pacific, hunting the Japanese fleet. Long-range patrol aircraft could cover the approaches to Britain and North America. But in the middle of the Atlantic, the Black Pit, pilots called it, there was a 900-mile gap where no land-based plane could reach. In that gap, the U-boats thrived. A convoy would leave New York with 40 ships. By the time it reached Liverpool, 32 remained, then 28, then 19. Destroyers could hunt U-boats, but only after the submarines attacked. And a destroyer couldn't be everywhere at once. What the convoys needed was air cover, continuous air cover. Eyes in the sky, circling, hunting, dropping depth charges before the U-boat even got close. But how do you put aircraft over the middle of the ocean, 1,000 miles from the nearest airfield? You bring the airfield with you. Lieutenant James T. Holder was Daniel Sullivan's best friend. They'd met at flight school in Pensacola, 2 Midwesterners in a sea of Ivy League types. Holder was from Omaha, Nebraska. His dad ran a hardware store on Dodge Street. Holder planned to take it over after the war, expand it, maybe open a second location. Holder and Sons, he'd say, got a nice ring to it. Holder flew a Grumman TBF Avenger, a torpedo bomber repurposed for anti-submarine work. It was a big, ugly plane, tough as a nail. 3-man crew, pilot, radio man, gunner, range of 100 miles. Could carry depth charges, torpedoes, or rockets. On March 12, 1943, Holder was flying convoy patrol 180 miles west of the Bogue, one of the first escort carriers deployed to the Atlantic. The convoy was designated HX-228, 31 merchant ships, 6 escorts. At 2:14 p.m., Holder's radio man spotted a periscope. Holder dove. The U-boat, later identified as U-757, crash-dived. Holder dropped 2 depth charges. Both missed. He circled, waiting for the submarine to resurface. Standard doctrine. The U-boat had to come up eventually. It needed to recharge batteries, get fresh air into the hull. Holder circled for 40 minutes. His fuel was running low. He had maybe 20 minutes before he'd have to head back to the Bogue. At 2:58 p.m., U-757 surfaced. Not where Holder expected, 800 yards behind him. The U-boat's deck gun opened fire. Holder's Avenger took 3 hits. The starboard wing shredded. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the canopy. Holder tried to turn, tried to bring the nose around for one last depth charge run. The Avenger cartwheeled into the ocean at 140 knots. The convoy picked up the radio man, Seaman David Chen, from San Francisco. He'd been thrown clear on impact. Chen said Holder never stopped trying to line up the shot, even as the plane was falling. They never found Holder's body. Holder's death wasn't unusual. Between January and May 1943, U-boats sank 14 Allied ships for every submarine lost. The math was brutal. At that rate, Germany would win the Battle of the Atlantic by sheer attrition. And there was another problem, one that nobody wanted to talk about. The baby flat-tops weren't working. The first escort carriers, USS Bogue, USS Card, USS Core, arrived in the Atlantic in early 1943. The idea was sound. Put a floating airfield in the middle of every convoy, give the U-boats nowhere to hide. But the execution was a disaster. The flight decks were too short. Pilots had to land on a 475-foot runway, on a ship rolling in 20-foot swells, often in the dark, often in storms. In the first 6 months of escort carrier operations, 41% of all aircraft losses were from landing accidents, not enemy action. The catapults, designed to help planes get airborne from the short deck, broke constantly. On the USS Santee, the catapult failed 7 times in 2 weeks. Pilots had to take off without it, which meant they couldn't carry a full load of fuel and weapons. A Grumman Wildcat fighter could normally carry 240 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition per gun. On the escort carriers, they carried 180 because every pound mattered on that short deck. The elevators, used to bring aircraft from the hangar deck to the flight deck, jammed in salt spray. On the USS Suwannee, the aft elevator stuck in the up position for 6 days. Half the air group couldn't launch. The radios didn't work. The TBF Avengers used VHF radio to communicate with the ship, but the escort carrier's radio masts were so short, mounted low to keep the ship's profile small, that range was limited to 12 miles. An Avenger on patrol could be 70 miles out. If it spotted a U-boat, the pilot had to fly halfway back just to report it. And then there was the speed problem. A convoy moved at 8 knots, the speed of the slowest merchant ship. The escort carriers had to stay with the convoy. That meant they were traveling at 8 knots when they launched aircraft. To get an Avenger airborne, you needed 65 knots of wind over the deck, combined ship speed and natural wind. If the carrier was moving at 8 knots, you needed 57 knots of natural wind. In the middle of the Atlantic, the average wind speed was 22 knots. Do the math. 8 knots ship speed plus 22 knots wind equals 30 knots over the deck. You need 65. You're 35 knots short, so the carrier had to break formation. Steam away from the convoy at flank speed, 19 knots. Turn into the wind. Launch aircraft. Then race back to catch up with the convoy, which had kept plodding along at 8 knots. Launching a 4-plane patrol took 47 minutes. In that time, the convoy traveled 2 miles. It took the carrier another 19 minutes to catch up. During those 66 minutes, the convoy had no destroyer screen. The destroyers had to stay with the carrier because the carrier was defenseless. No armor, no big guns, just a few 40mm anti-aircraft mounts. The U-boats learned this. They'd wait until they saw the carrier speed up and turn away. Then they'd attack the convoy. Between March and July 1943, 14 convoys escorted by jeep carriers lost a combined 91 ships. The baby flat-tops were supposed to be the solution. They were becoming part of the problem. Daniel Sullivan took command of the USS Guadalcanal in January 1944. He'd been a flight operations officer on the Bogue, watching Holder and 32 other pilots die, watching convoy after convoy get mauled despite having air cover. The Guadalcanal was a Casablanca-class escort carrier, newest model. Slightly bigger, slightly faster. It displaced 10 900 tons, could make 19 knots on a good day. It had 28 aircraft, 12 Grumman FM-2 Wildcats, 16 Grumman TBM Avengers. Sullivan knew the statistics. He knew the tactical problems, and he knew something else, something he'd learned on the ore boats in Duluth. You don't fight the lake, you use it. The Atlantic wasn't an enemy. It was terrain, and terrain could be weaponized. Sullivan started making notes in a leather journal. He'd write late at night after the last patrol landed, standing in the island superstructure with a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The notes weren't official. They weren't part of any Navy doctrine, they were questions. Why do we stay with the convoy? Why do we launch all aircraft at once? Why do we wait for the U-boat to surface? What if we hunted instead of escorted? On March 8, 1944, Sullivan broke protocol. Convoy TS-37 was 12 hours out of Gibraltar, bound for Norfolk. Sullivan was supposed to launch dawn patrol at 0600, recover at 0900, launch midday patrol at 1200. Instead, he launched a single Avenger at 0430, 90 minutes early. The pilot, Lieutenant Robert Stearns, thought it was a mistake. He climbed into the cockpit, checked his orders 3 times. Nope, solo patrol. Launch at 0430. Search pattern Delta 7. Stearns launched into darkness. The carrier's deck crew hadn't even finished their coffee. At 0512, Stearns spotted a surfaced U-boat 140 miles west of the convoy. The submarine, U-515, was charging batteries, making a leisurely 8 knots on the surface. The commander probably figured no Allied patrol would be flying for another 90 minutes. Stearns dropped 4 depth charges from 150 feet. U-515 sank in 4 minutes. When Stearns landed back on the Guadalcanal, Sullivan was waiting on the flight deck. He shook Stearns's hand, said nothing, walked back to the island. That night, Sullivan wrote one more note. They expect us at dawn, so we fly before dawn. For 2 weeks, Sullivan ran experiments. He didn't tell anyone, not the convoy commodore, not his own air group commander, definitely not Admiral Royal Ingersoll, Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, who had very specific ideas about how escort carriers should operate. Sullivan started launching aircraft at random times, 0330, 1147, 22:119. Sometimes a single plane, sometimes 4, never the same interval twice. He stopped launching from fixed positions. Instead of steaming away from the convoy to launch, he'd launch whenever wind conditions allowed, even if it meant the convoy pulled ahead. He'd catch up later. He stopped recovering aircraft on schedule. Pilots would radio in, low on fuel, requesting permission to land. Sullivan's response, negative. Orbit at Angels 8. We'll call you in. The pilots thought he'd lost his mind, but Sullivan had done the math. A TBM Avenger burned 72 gallons of fuel per hour at cruise speed. It carried 335 gallons. That gave it 4 hours and 37 minutes of flight time, with a 30-minute reserve. Navy doctrine said to recover aircraft after 3 hours, land, refuel, rearm, launch again. Sullivan kept them up for 4 hours, sometimes 4.5. That extra hour meant constant coverage. There was always a plane in the air, always eyes on the water. The U-boats never got a break, and Sullivan did something else, something that violated every rule in the book. He left the convoy. On March 23, 1944, the Guadalcanal was escorting convoy UGS-37, 48 merchant ships, 8 escorts, bound for Casablanca. At 1400 hours, one of Sullivan's Avengers spotted a U-boat 90 miles north of the convoy. The pilot radioed the position. Standard procedure: stay with the convoy. Let the destroyers hunt the submarine. Sullivan turned the Guadalcanal north, flank speed, 19 knots. His executive officer, Commander Harold Thibord, grabbed Sullivan's arm. "Sir, we're leaving the convoy exposed." Sullivan pulled free. "The convoy has 8 escorts. That U-boat has friends. We're going hunting." The Guadalcanal steamed north for 3 hours. Sullivan launched 6 Avengers in rotation, 2 in the air, 2 refueling, 2 on standby. He sent his destroyer escorts ahead, racing at 30 knots, dropping patterns of depth charges every 20 minutes. At 1847 hours, sonar picked up a contact, 400 feet down, moving at 6 knots. U-233. The destroyers dropped 18 depth charges. The submarine dove to 600 feet. The Avengers circled overhead, dropping sonobuoys, listening devices that could track the sub acoustically. At 2031 hours, U-233 surfaced. Compressed air exhausted, batteries dead, hull cracked in 3 places. The crew surrendered. 57 men, including the captain, Captain Lieutenant Hans Steen. The Guadalcanal returned to the convoy at 0200 hours the next morning. The convoy commodore sent a tersely worded message. "Where the hell have you been?" Sullivan didn't answer, but word spread to other escort carriers, other task groups. The baby Flattop had left the convoy and hunted a submarine to exhaustion. Nobody had done that before. Sullivan kept pushing. On April 9th, the Guadalcanal detected U-515 on sonar, the same submarine that had killed Holder's crew. Sullivan launched 8 aircraft and 3 destroyer escorts. They chased the submarine for 17 hours. The U-boat dove, surfaced, dove again, tried every evasion tactic in the German playbook. At 1420 hours on April 10th, U-515 surfaced for the last time. Out of battery, out of compressed air, out of luck. The destroyer USS Pope put 2 torpedoes into her hull. Sullivan was on the bridge when U-515 went down. He didn't celebrate. He just nodded once, turned to his executive officer and said, "Jim would have liked that." Between March 8 and May 15, 1944, the USS Guadalcanal and her task group sank 6 U-boats. Not damaged, not forced to withdraw. Sunk. 6 submarines in 68 days. No other escort carrier group had sunk more than 2 in an entire deployment. And Sullivan's convoys? In those same 68 days, escorting 9 convoys totaling 387 merchant ships, the Guadalcanal lost 3 vessels to U-boat attack, 3 ships out of 387, a loss rate of 0.77%. The average loss rate for Atlantic convoys in early 1944 was 4.2%. The baby Flattop was working, but not the way the Navy had planned. Other commanders started copying Sullivan's tactics. The USS Card under Captain Arnold J. Isbell began launching pre-dawn patrols. The USS Core, under Captain Marshall R. Greer, started hunter-killer operations, leaving convoys to pursue U-boat contacts. The USS Bogue, the carrier where Holder had died, sank 8 U-boats between May and September 1944, using Sullivan's methods. The statistics shifted. In the second quarter of 1944, escort carrier groups sank 31 U-boats. In the third quarter, 42. By the fourth quarter, German submarines were staying submerged for days at a time, running on batteries, burning through their oxygen, because they knew that surfacing meant death. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, sent a message to his captains on August 12, 1944. "Allied air coverage is now continuous. Surface running is forbidden except in extreme emergency. Battery conservation is now secondary to survival." The U-boats had lost the Atlantic. The baby Flattops had won. But Sullivan wasn't done. On June 4, 1944, the Guadalcanal was escorting a convoy 600 miles west of Ireland when sonar detected a massive underwater contact. Too big for a U-boat, too slow for a destroyer, a submarine tender, a supply ship. The Germans called them milch cows, Type 14th U-boats designed to refuel and resupply attack submarines at sea. Finding one was like finding a gas station in the middle of the ocean. If you sank it, every submarine that depended on it would have to head home. Early, before completing their mission, Sullivan launched every available aircraft, 16 planes. He sent his destroyers ahead at maximum speed. The Guadalcanal turned into the wind, launched, recovered, launched again. For 8 hours, Sullivan kept aircraft over that contact, tracking, harassing, preventing the submarine from diving deep or running fast. At 22:47 hours, the submarine surfaced. U-488, a Type 4T milch cow, 600 tons, carried 432 tons of fuel oil, 4 torpedoes, and provisions for 5 submarines. The destroyer USS Frost put 3 5-inch shells into the conning tower. U-488 went down with all hands. 3 weeks later, naval intelligence intercepted German radio traffic. 5 U-boats, U-123, U-185, U-5M16, U-539, and U-boat 172, had been ordered to abort their patrols and return to base. They couldn't reach their rendezvous with U-488. 5 submarines. Gone. Not because they were sunk, but because their gas station had disappeared. Sullivan's baby Flattop had taken out 6 submarines without firing a shot. In September 1944, Admiral Ingersoll flew out to the Guadalcanal. He wanted to see Sullivan's operation firsthand. He wanted to understand how a ship that wasn't supposed to fight had become the deadliest submarine killer in the Atlantic Fleet. Sullivan gave him a tour, showed him the flight deck, the hangar, the ready room where pilots slept in shifts, showed him the map in the Combat Information Center, covered with red pins marking U-boat sinkings. Ingersoll asked the question everyone was asking. "How are you doing this?" Sullivan shrugged. "We stopped escorting, started hunting." Ingersoll frowned. "You're leaving convoys exposed." Sullivan pointed at the map. "In 6 months we've escorted 14 convoys, lost 5 ships total. The convoys we left had 8 destroyers and 20 corvettes. They don't need us for defense. They need us to kill submarines before the submarines find them." Ingersoll stared at the map for a long time, then he nodded. "Keep doing what you're doing." 3 days later, new orders went out to all Atlantic escort carrier groups. Offensive operations against enemy submarines are now primary mission. Convoy escort is secondary. The Navy had officially endorsed what Sullivan had been doing illegally for 6 months. Between January and December 1944, escort carrier groups in the Atlantic sank 83 German U-boats. That was more than the entire U.S. Submarine force sank in the Pacific in the same period. The baby Flattops, slow, fragile, half the size of real carriers, had become the most effective submarine killers in naval history. But back in Washington, the bureaucrats were arguing about credit. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, wanted the victory attributed to improvements in destroyer doctrine. Admiral Ingersoll wanted credit for the escort carrier program. The British Admiralty claimed their corvettes and frigates had done the heavy lifting. Nobody mentioned Sullivan. On January 15, 1945, the Guadalcanal returned to Norfolk for refit. Sullivan had been at sea for 11 months straight. His ship had escorted 22 convoys, lost 9 merchant ships total, and sunk 12 U-boats, more than any other escort carrier in the war. Sullivan received the Navy Cross. The citation praised his aggressive leadership and tactical innovation. His crew received nothing, standard practice. Officers get medals, enlisted men get liberty. 3 months later, the war in Europe ended. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The U-boat fleet surrendered on May 9th. Of the 162 U-boats commissioned during the war, 785 were sunk. Escort carriers accounted for 119 of those kills, 15% of the total, despite representing less than 3% of Allied naval assets. The baby Flattops had punched above their weight, way above. Sullivan was reassigned to a training command in San Diego. He spent 2 years teaching new pilots how to land on short decks. He never commanded a ship again. In 1947, Sullivan resigned his commission. He was 30 years old. He moved back to Duluth, got a job as a harbor pilot, guiding ore freighters through the shipping channels he'd known as a teenager. He married a local girl, Patricia Mackenzie, a schoolteacher. They had 3 kids. Sullivan never talked about the war, never mentioned the Guadalcanal, never told his children he'd sunk 12 submarines. His neighbors knew him as Dan, the quiet guy who worked on the docks and coached Little League on weekends. In 1983, a naval historian named Samuel Eliot Morrison published a comprehensive history of the U.S. Navy in World War II. Volume X covered the Battle of the Atlantic. There were 2 paragraphs about the USS Guadalcanal. Sullivan's name appeared once. The book credited the victory in the Atlantic to superior Allied technology and resources. In 1997, a graduate student at the Naval War College wrote a thesis on escort carrier tactics. She interviewed 17 veterans of Atlantic convoy duty. 8 of them mentioned Sullivan by name. One pilot, Robert Stearns, the man who'd sunk U-515, said, "Sullivan saved my life 4 times. He saved 1,000 other sailors and never got a damn bit of credit for it." The thesis was filed in the college archives. 12 people read it. Daniel Sullivan died on March 18, 2001, in Duluth, Minnesota. He was 83 years old, heart attack, quick and painless. His obituary in the Duluth News-Tribune was 4 sentences long. It mentioned he'd served in the Navy during World War II. It did not mention the Guadalcanal. It did not mention the 12 U-boats. It did not mention that he'd pioneered the tactics that won the Battle of the Atlantic. It mentioned he was survived by his wife, 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. There is a small exhibit at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. It's in the corner of the Atlantic Theatre wing, easy to miss. A glass case with a model of a Casablanca-class escort carrier. A placard that reads, "Baby Flattops, the unsung heroes of the Atlantic." Sullivan's name is not on the placard, but on a shelf in the museum's research library there's a leather journal. Donated by Patricia Sullivan in 2003, it's filled with notes in neat handwriting. Questions, calculations, tactical diagrams. On the last page, dated May 15, 1944, there's a single sentence, "Holder would have been proud." The baby Flattops weren't supposed to win the Battle of the Atlantic. They were too small, too slow, too fragile. But they had something the battleships and the big carriers didn't have: commanders who refused to follow the rules. Men like Daniel Sullivan, who understood that sometimes the only way to win is to stop escorting and start hunting. But Sullivan's most dangerous mission was still ahead. September 17, 1944. 2:34 a.m., North Atlantic, 180 miles southwest of Iceland. The radar operator's voice cracked over the intercom. "Contacts, multiple contacts, bearing 270, range 40 miles. Count..." "Jesus, sir, I count at least 15. Sullivan was in the Combat Information Center within 30 seconds, still in his skivvies, barefoot on the cold steel deck. He leaned over the radar scope. The operator was right. 15 blips, moving in formation. Speed, 16 knots. Not merchant ships. Merchant ships didn't travel in perfect formation at 16 knots. "Battle stations," Sullivan said quietly. "Wake the air group. I want 6 Avengers armed and ready in 10 minutes. Commander Thabord appeared at his elbow. "Sir, that's a wolf pack, a big one. We've never faced more than 3 U-boats at once." Sullivan studied the radar. The German submarines were spread in a line 8 miles across, a coordinated attack formation. They'd been tracking convoy HX-305 for hours, probably, waiting for the right moment. Convoy HX-305 had 62 merchant ships, 8 destroyer escorts, and the Guadalcanal, against 15 U-boats. The math was bad, really bad. Sullivan had 2 choices: stay with the convoy, use his aircraft defensively, hope the destroyers could hold off the Wolfpack, or do what he'd been doing for 6 months, attack. "Launch as soon as we're ready," Sullivan said. 6 Avengers, depth charges and rockets. Tell the pilots we're going straight at them." The board stared. "Sir, if we leave the convoy has 8 escorts. We have 15 targets. If we can break up their formation, scatter them, the destroyers can handle the rest." "And if we can't?" Sullivan pulled on his uniform jacket. "Then 62 ships are going to the bottom, and it won't matter where we are." At 02:47 hours, the first Avenger launched. Lieutenant Howard Avery, 23 years old, from Portland, Oregon. His radio man was Petty Officer First Class Martin Webb from Nashville, Tennessee. His gunner was Seaman Louis Caputo from Brooklyn, New York. Avery's orders were simple: fly straight at the Wolfpack. Drop depth charges on anything that looks like a submarine. Don't come back until you're out of weapons or out of fuel. Avery launched into darkness. No moon, cloud cover at 800 feet, visibility maybe 2 miles. 5 more Avengers followed him, launching at 90-second intervals. The Guadalcanal turned away from the convoy, steaming west at 19 knots, directly toward the Wolfpack. Every officer on the bridge thought Sullivan had lost his mind. But Sullivan had done something nobody else knew about. For 3 weeks, he'd been experimenting with night radar bombing. The TBM Avengers had ASV radar, air-to-surface vessel radar designed to detect surface submarines. The pilots hated it. The scope was small, hard to read, especially at night. Most of them ignored it. Sullivan had made it mandatory training. Every pilot in his air group had spent 20 hours practicing radar approaches, learning to read the blips, learning to estimate range, and bearing from the scope alone. Now, at 0251 hours, in total darkness, 6 Avengers were converging on 15 U-boats using nothing but radar. Avery saw his first contact at 0257 hours. Range, 3 miles. Bearing, 285 degrees. He banked left, descended to 200 feet, lined up on the blip. At 1 mile he saw it, a dark shape on darker water. Conning tower, deck gun, surfaced U-boat, making 16 knots on diesel engines. Avery didn't radio. No time. He armed his depth charges, pushed the throttle forward, dove. The U-boat saw him at 400 yards. The deck gun swiveled. Tracers arced up, orange streaks in the darkness. Avery dropped 4 depth charges from 150 feet. 2 hit the water 30 yards ahead of the submarine. 2 hit 20 yards behind. The ocean erupted, white geysers, 100 feet tall. The U-boat, U-1226, shuddered, rolled hard to starboard. The stern lifted out of the water. The propellers screamed, spinning in air. U-1226 went down stern first. 47 seconds from depth charge impact to total sinking. Avery pulled up, climbed back to 500 feet, checked his radar. Another contact, 2 miles north. He turned, attacked, dropped 2 more depth charges. U-978 survived the attack, but took damage to her diving planes. She couldn't submerge. Commander Klaus Notzke ordered the crew to abandon ship. They scuttled her with demolition charges. 51 men in life rafts, waiting for rescue that would never come. At 3:12 hours, Lieutenant Robert Stearns, the same pilot who'd sunk U-515 6 months earlier, found 3 U-boats running in formation. They were on the surface, moving fast, trying to get into attack position on the convoy. Stearns radioed back to the Guadalcanal. 3 contacts running line abreast, engaging. He picked the center submarine, U-1223, dropped 4 depth charges. The explosions bracketed the U-boat. The hull cracked. The forward battery compartment flooded. U-1223 began sinking immediately, but slowly, taking 6 minutes to go under. That gave the other 2 submarines time to react. U-764 and U-425 crash-dived. They went deep, 400 feet, running silent. But Stearns had dropped sonobuoys, acoustic listening devices, before his attack. He could track them underwater. He circled overhead, waiting, listening. At 0329 hours, U-764 surfaced. Out of battery power, the captain had no choice. Stearns dove, fired 2 rockets. Both missed. He came around for another pass, but U-764 was already diving again. The captain had gotten just enough air into the ballast tanks to submerge one more time. Stearns dropped his last 2 depth charges. Pure guesswork. He couldn't see the submarine, couldn't track it accurately on radar. 1 depth charge detonated 200 feet from U-764. Close enough. The shock wave ruptured the pressure hull. The submarine imploded at 380 feet. In 18 minutes, the Guadalcanal's air group had sunk 4 U-boats, but there were still 11 more out there. And the baby Flattop was now 40 miles away from the convoy, steaming in the wrong direction, with only 2 aircraft still armed. Sullivan knew the gamble. He'd committed everything to breaking up the wolf pack. If it didn't work, if the U-boats ignored the aircraft and went after the convoy anyway, 62 merchant ships would be defenseless. But the U-boats didn't ignore the aircraft, because Admiral Karl Dönitz had given his submarine commanders explicit orders: if you encounter an escort carrier, sink it. The carriers are the primary threat. Sink the carrier, the aircraft go away. At 0341 hours, 7 U-boats broke off their attack on the convoy. They turned west, toward the Guadalcanal. Sullivan saw them on radar. 7 contacts converging on his position from 3 directions. "They're coming for us," Sullivan said. The board went pale. "Sir, we need to run. Get back to the convoy, get the destroyers between us and—" "No, launch the reserve aircraft, everything we've got. Strip the fighters, arm them with depth charges. Sir, the Wildcats aren't designed for... Launch them anyway. At 03:45 hours, 8 more aircraft launched from the Guadalcanal, 4 Avengers, 4 FM-2 Wildcats. The Wildcats carried 2 250-pound depth charges each, not standard loadout, not even tested in combat. Sullivan's ordnance crew had rigged the bombs to the wing pylons that afternoon. Nobody knew if they'd work. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Valencia led the Wildcat Division. He was 27 from San Francisco, a fighter pilot who'd shot down 7 Japanese planes in the Pacific before transferring to the Atlantic. He'd never dropped a depth charge in his life. Valencia found his first U-boat at 0351 hours, U-962, running on the surface heading straight for the Guadalcanal, range 12 miles. Valencia dove. The Wildcat screamed down from 300 feet, hitting 300 knots. The U-boat's deck gun opened fire. Tracers everywhere. Valencia didn't flinch. He pulled the release at 200 feet. Both depth charges dropped. One missed by 50 yards. The other hit the water 10 yards off the submarine's port beam. The explosion lifted U-962 completely out of the water. The hull broke in half. The bow section went down immediately. The stern section floated for 19 seconds before sinking. Valencia pulled up, checked his fuel. He had maybe 40 minutes before he'd have to head back. He found another contact, U-681. Attacked. Missed. Found another. U-1020. Attacked. Hit. The U-boat took damage but stayed afloat. It began limping away, trailing oil. At 04:18 hours, the Guadalcanal picked up a sonar contact. Close. Too close. Submarine, bearing 090, range 800 yards. Sullivan ran to the bridge wing. He could see it now, a periscope cutting through the water, heading directly for the carrier. The destroyer USS Pillsbury was 3 miles away, too far. The Guadalcanal had no torpedoes, no depth charges, just a few 40mm anti-aircraft guns. Sullivan grabbed the helm himself. Hard right rudder, flank speed. The baby flat top turned, slowly. So slowly. Escort carriers weren't built for evasive maneuvers. The periscope disappeared. The submarine, U-546, was lining up for a torpedo shot. At 04:20 hours, U-546 fired 2 torpedoes. Range 600 yards. Sullivan saw the wakes, white lines on dark water coming straight at him. Brace for impact! The first torpedo passed 50 feet ahead of the bow. The second passed 30 feet behind the stern. Both missed. U-546 had fired at where the Guadalcanal should have been, but Sullivan's turn, painfully slow, barely 8 knots of turning speed, had been just enough. The submarine surfaced, out of torpedoes, out of luck. The destroyer Pillsbury arrived at 04:23 hours. Fired 5 5-inch shells, 3 hit. U-546 sank in 2 minutes. By 04:45 hours it was over. Sullivan's aircraft had sunk 7 U-boats, damaged 4 more so badly they had to abort and head home. The remaining 4 submarines scattered, abandoning the attack on convoy HX-305. The convoy lost 0 ships. 0. The Guadalcanal had 16 aircraft. 15 returned. 1 Avenger, piloted by Lieutenant Howard Avery, ditched 60 miles from the carrier. Fuel exhaustion. The crew was picked up by a destroyer 3 hours later. All 3 men survived. Sullivan stood on the bridge as the sun came up. He hadn't slept in 22 hours. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from adrenaline wearing off. Commander Thibaud approached quietly. "Sir, I need to apologize. I doubted you. I was wrong." Sullivan shook his head. "You were right to doubt me. I gambled 62 ships and 4 Zuonzeren lives on a theory. If it hadn't worked. But it did work." Sullivan looked out at the convoy. 62 merchant ships, steaming east in neat columns, safe, alive. "This time," Sullivan said, "the battle became known as the Night of the Baby Flattop." Naval intelligence later determined it was the largest Wolfpack concentration in the North Atlantic in 1944. 15 U-boats, coordinated attack, perfect tactical setup, and a single escort carrier had destroyed it. Admiral Dönitz sent a message to all remaining U-boat commanders on September 20, 1944. "New directive. Escort carriers are priority targets. But do not engage unless tactical advantage is overwhelming. The Americans have changed their doctrine. The carriers now hunt aggressively. Avoid surface running within 200 miles of confirmed carrier presence. The U-boats were on the defensive. For the first time in the war they were the prey, but there was something else, something the Navy didn't talk about in official reports. The cost. Sullivan's aggressive tactics worked, but they killed pilots. Between March and September 1944, the Guadalcanal lost 23 aircraft, 9 to mechanical failure, 8 to weather, 6 to enemy action. More importantly, Sullivan lost 11 men, pilots, radiomen, gunners. Most died in landing accidents, coming back to the carrier at night, in bad weather, low on fuel, trying to land on a 475-foot deck that was pitching and rolling in heavy seas. Sullivan knew every name, every hometown, every detail. Lieutenant Richard Paulson, 24, from Des Moines, Iowa. Crashed on landing, July 14th. Plane went over the side. Body never recovered. Ensign Thomas Garrett, 22, from Richmond, Virginia. Ditched at sea, August 3rd. Rescue destroyer couldn't find him in the dark. Presumed drowned. Petty Officer 2nd Class Anthony DeMarco, 21, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Killed when his Avenger exploded on the catapult, August 19th. Faulty fuel line. He burned to death before the fire crew could reach him. Sullivan wrote letters to every family. Personal letters, not the standard form letter most commanders sent. He wrote about how their son had served, what he'd accomplished, how he'd been respected by his fellow pilots. He never mentioned that he was the one who'd ordered them to fly at night, in storms, beyond the safety margins. He never mentioned that his tactics, the tactics that were winning the war, were also killing his own men. In September 1944, a Navy psychologist visited the Guadalcanal. Standard procedure: check the crew's mental health, watch for signs of combat fatigue. The psychologist, Lieutenant Commander Paul Fisher, interviewed 32 men. He wrote in his report, "Commander Sullivan exhibits signs of acute stress and survivor guilt. He blames himself for every pilot lost, despite achieving unprecedented success rate. Recommend immediate relief and transfer to non-combat duty." Admiral Ingersoll read the report, filed it, did nothing, because Sullivan was winning. And in war, you don't relieve commanders who win. On October 12, 1944, Sullivan was summoned to Norfolk. He thought he was being relieved. Finally. He was exhausted, physically and mentally. He wanted to stop. He wanted to sleep without seeing Holder's face, without hearing the names of the 11 men he'd lost. Instead, Admiral Ingersoll pinned the Navy Cross on his uniform. "Commander Sullivan," Ingersoll said, reading from a prepared statement, "for extraordinary heroism in combat operations against enemy submarine forces. Your innovative tactics and aggressive leadership have resulted in the sinking of 12 enemy submarines and the protection of over 400 merchant vessels. You are hereby commended for service above and beyond the call of duty." There was a photographer, a ceremony, handshakes, congratulations. Sullivan stood there feeling nothing. The medal was heavy, cold. That night, Sullivan sat alone in his quarters. He took out his leather journal. He'd stopped writing in it weeks ago. There was nothing left to figure out. He'd solved the tactical problem. He'd found the way to make the baby Flattops work. But the cost kept rising. He opened the journal to a blank page, wrote one sentence. How many more? He never finished the thought. The next morning, the Guadalcanal put to sea. Convoy on 263, 51 merchant ships bound for New York. Sullivan stood on the bridge, watching the convoy form up. Commander Thibord approached with the flight roster. "Sir, we've got 2 new pilots, fresh from training. This is their first deployment." Sullivan looked at the names. Ensign Robert Mackenzie, 23, from Seattle, Washington. Ensign Charles Whitmore, 22, from Atlanta, Georgia. "Have they done night landings?" Sullivan asked. 6, sir, in training." 6. Holder had done 600 night landings, and Holder had died. Sullivan handed back the roster. "Keep them on daylight patrols until they've got 20 night landings, minimum. Sir, we need every pilot for night operations. The new directive says—" "I don't care what the directive says. Keep them on daylight patrols." Sullivan walked away before Thibord could argue. Because Sullivan had realized something. The Navy would keep using his tactics. Other carriers would copy them. More pilots would fly at night in storms pushing the limits, and more would die. Not from U-boats, from exhaustion, from bad weather. From trying to land on a pitching deck in the dark because the mission required it. The baby Flattops were winning the war, but they were eating their own. Sullivan commanded the Guadalcanal for 3 more months. He sank 5 more U-boats, lost 9 more men. When he finally left the ship in January 1945, he'd lost 20 men total. 20 pilots, radio men, gunners. 20 names he'd never forget. The Guadalcanal earned a Presidential Unit citation, the first escort carrier to receive one. The citation praised the ship's extraordinary heroism and aggressive spirit in combat operations against enemy forces. It mentioned Sullivan once, in passing. It didn't mention the 20 men who died making those tactics work. Years later, in 1992, a reporter from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel tracked Sullivan down in Duluth. The reporter was writing a feature article about unsung World War II heroes. Someone had mentioned Sullivan's name. The reporter asked about the Navy Cross, about the tactics, about the 12 U-boats. Sullivan answered politely, briefly, gave the reporter the facts, the dates, the numbers. Then the reporter asked, "Do you think the aggressive tactics were worth it? All those U-boats sunk, all those convoys protected. Do you think the cost was justified?" Sullivan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You should talk to the families of the men who flew for me. Ask them if it was worth it." The reporter asked for names. Sullivan gave him 20, with hometowns, with details he'd remembered for 47 years. The article ran on Veterans Day, 1992. It was 3 pages long. It mentioned Sullivan's tactics, his success rate, his Navy Cross. The last 2 paragraphs were quotes from Paulson's mother, from Garrett's brother, from DeMarco's widow. All of them said the same thing. Their sons, their brother, their husband had been proud to serve under Commander Sullivan. They'd believed in the mission, they'd known the risks, and they'd have done it again. Sullivan never read the article. His wife Patricia read it to him. He sat in his chair in their living room in Duluth listening. When she finished, he didn't say anything. He just nodded once. And for the first time in 47 years, he cried. The baby Flattops weren't just small carriers that punched above their weight. They were proof that sometimes innovation requires sacrifice. That victory has a price that doesn't show up in statistics or after-action reports. Daniel Sullivan saved thousands of lives, but he carried 20 names with him until the day he died. That's the part of the story nobody tells. That's the part that doesn't make it into the museum exhibits or the history books. But it's the part that matters most. If this story moved you, we need your help to make sure heroes like Commander Sullivan aren't forgotten. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that real history matters. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing you these incredible stories of courage and innovation. And please, drop a comment below. Tell us, did someone in your family serve in World War II? Were they on convoy duty in the Atlantic? Did they know about the baby Flattops? We read every single comment, and your family's stories deserve to be heard. Thank you for keeping these heroes alive. Thank you for watching.